Last video in this tutorial series. We're going to cover about 4 different topics here, but they're all reasonably straightforward. And this time around I've also pre-done all the coding. We're just going to look at how it works. So here we have our game as it will be at the end. The first big difference is we've now created a title screen, so you can see we're in this title screen at the moment when the game first loads. It really is just backgrounds and sprites primarily. But the main difference is we've created a button here that we can click on to begin our game. We'll talk about how that happens. In our game itself, to start with, it doesn't look much different. The main difference here now is I've got a little animation, as you can see, when the ship explodes, and you should also be able to hear a little explosion sound effect. And the last part, of course, is when you do in fact die, it goes back to the title screen now, so you can restart the game. When you do restart, of course, scores go back to 0 and so forth. So what in fact have we done? Let's have a look. Firstly, let's have a look at what's been added. We've added one more background. Again, I've literally just made a duplicate copy of the background for that we already have. So if I look at my title background now, this is the new one. I started by taking that exact background. I literally just went to copy and paste it or duplicate it, renamed it, and I've added in, by editing it, of course, like we've seen before, I just added in the same character I have for my ship. I did some basic text, 2 layers of it, just to get sort of a background here, an edging around it. Of course, as we've said before, you can design your backgrounds and your sprites and so forth in any drawing package you like. But again, this is just another background, so there's nothing special about that. The play button itself is also just a sprite. So here I have just drawn a rectangle, some writing on it. It's just a basic sprite that we use later on for an object. The only one that's kind of a little bit different is the enemy explosion sprite, because we've now introduced animation, and that's something we haven't covered before. So we'll come back and have a look at that properly. But basically, you might already be able to tell what's going to happen. The other change, of course, is we have a second room now. So I've renamed the main room that we've been using as room game, and I now have a room title room as well. And in here, all I've done is put that background in, and I've put this play object, which we'll see in a second as well. And then from there, of course, I've got a couple of extra objects. Well, really, actually, only one extra object. 2, sorry. I've got the play button object itself and the exploding enemy object, and I'll explain again why we have both of those. So let's go back to the rooms just for a moment. Something to know about GameMaker is that the very first room in the list here, so this now says room title, is the room that gets loaded when your game starts. So making sure that I have room title, in this case, as the first room, means that my game will open up and be on this title screen to begin with, which is what I want. There are other ways to do that, of course, but that's the simplest way, just to make sure your title screen or something that you want is the first one, so you can control where to go from there. So room game, nothing's really changed in there. And we need a way now to go from room title to the next room so that we can actually play the game. And that's where our play button object comes in. So again, that is just an object that we've created and given that sprite from before. So let's have a look at that button first. It is super simple, right? It has a sprite like we talked about. I've used the left pressed for the mouse. So again, it's just an add event, go down to mouse, and I've used the left press. You could also add a second button, maybe a key press, that if you press P as well, it also plays the game. You could add multiple things. But in that event, it literally has one command. The command is room underscore go to, and what we want to do is use the name of the room. Now, there are some other commands for moving between rooms, so you can go room underscore next, for example, which will take you to the next one in the list, and that would work in this particular case because the next one in the list is room game. But you've got to be careful using things like next and previous, because if there isn't another room in the list, let's say I was in game and I tried to go next, I'd actually get an error that would crash the game. My personal suggestion, what I always do is explicitly use this room go to, and that way I can tell it exactly what room to go to. So unless I don't have that room, of course, I'm guaranteed that it's not going to crash the game. If I don't have that room name, of course, then it will also crash the game. So that's as simple as it is. You just use room underscore go to, the name of the room, exactly what you called it over here in the resources, and that will then move to that next room. So there's really nothing to creating buttons. It's just create a sprite into an object and give it a command it needs to do. In this case, move to the next room. Very, very simple. Okay, let's talk about the next one, and that is the exploding enemy. And that's where most of the rest of today's work happens. So let's have a look at that. We'll go back and talk about the animation in a second, but basically what I've got happening here is that when we hit the enemy with our bullet and we want to destroy it, currently it just disappears. We just literally destroy that object. But what I'm actually having happen here now is it does still destroy that object, but just before it gets destroyed, it creates another enemy in exactly the same position, and that is this enemy here, this enemy explode as I've called it. And all this one does is basically gets created in that spot, it plays our sound effect, and it also plays our animation, and as soon as that animation is finished, the explosion animation, then it destroys itself as well with no extra fuss. Now the reason I've done it this way is that our enemy knows how to respond to hitting the player and being hit by another bullet. Whereas what I've done here with this enemy explosion, it doesn't know anything about being hit by a bullet. So we don't have a possibility of shooting an exploding enemy with another bullet and having another explosion happen and things that we don't really want. So this way, it looks like it just stops where it is and explodes, but we don't possibly interact with the wrong things. So how exactly have we done that? Now the animation comes from the sprite, and as I said, we'll come back to that later. So just for this point, we just know that we've given it the correct sprite. The two things or two events that we have is first the create event, all right, and all I'm doing in the create event is playing the sound. So the play sound is super, super simple. It's audio play sound. It's the name of the sound resource, which I forgot to mention before. This number one just represents a priority. I usually put 1, and the false represents whether this should loop around over and over again. And being an explosion sound effect, we don't want it to keep going forever, so we put false. If you're going to play audio for, say, a music background that you want to keep playing, then you might make that true. So to put the sound in, sorry, I forgot to mention that, it's just in sound here, it's just adding in a sound, so create sound, give it a name, load a file, so WAV files, MP3 files, things like that. That's the one I chose to use here. And once you've made that, of course, you end up with a sound effect. So I've already got my sound explosion there. All right, so that's what I'm playing now in my enemy. All right. The other thing, of course, that I've done is use another special event which we haven't seen, which is called animation end. Now that is found in this special spot called other events, the sort of ones that don't fit into another category. And we can see there's a couple around animation. The one I want is animation end. So basically says that if the sprite is animated, as soon as it gets to the last frame of the sprite, it triggers this event. And I'm just using that now to do the destroy. Okay, so our normal enemy ship gets hit and destroyed. Just before it's destroyed, it's creating one of these objects right in the same spot, all right, using its X and Y. We can see that actually here. So in our collision with the bullet, okay, this is where it's destroying the bullet. This is now where it's creating the instance that we want. So creating on the same layer at the same position, our X and Y currently on the instance layer, this enemy exploding, okay? So then that object is now replaced essentially with this one, which starts by playing a sound effect. The animation runs. When the animation finishes, this happens, which is just to destroy itself. And that's how it all works. It's very, very straightforward. So that gives us pretty much everything that we need so far. The last thing before we look at that animation is just with the player itself. So again, with the enemy when it collides with the player. So again, when it collides with the player, that's when we want the player to die. Previously, we were just destroying the other thing, being the enemy ship, and destroying ourselves. So what we've done is it's still getting destroyed, but we've added the player destroy in here. So when this player is now getting destroyed, that's where we've added that room go to again. So just to try and make that clearer one more time, sorry. At the moment, when the enemy collides with the player ship, this is what we already had. So destroy the other thing in this collision, which is the player, and destroy yourself. When we destroy the player, technically that comes back to this event here. So in the player, it's getting destroyed. So this is where we are having the go back to the other room happen. It's exactly the same command. We just changed, obviously, the room to room title again. So I'm hoping that makes sense to you. I said 3 or 4 lines of code. It's pretty straightforward. The last thing we haven't looked at is the animation. So animation actually happens in the sprite. So we come back up to our sprite, explode. What I did here is I literally, again, just duplicated the enemy sprite, so everything else about it was the same. So when I replaced one with the other, it looks like it just stayed there. And we then did some animation. Now, again, I'm not a graphic artist. I'm certainly not claiming to have done the best graphics ever. But what we've seen in most of our, or in all our sprites so far, is what we call one frame. So again, if I just maybe open the enemy for a second, we've got one frame, right? So there's not really animation happening here. Animation in GameMaker, or at least the main form of animation, is to just use what would be called frame animation or cell animation, a very traditional style, which is where we have one picture followed by another slightly different picture, another slightly different picture, and so on, that as we play through them, it looks like it's being animated. In this case, all I did is I copied the existing frame and made some adjustments to it, right? So I just drew some exploding bits on it. Then I would copy that frame, so I get a second one, added some more bits to it, and so forth. So we get a bit of an explosion happening, all right? I can see how that might look by pressing the play button here, and that's what the animation would look like. Okay, so our animation just plays through. Again, if we didn't have that animation end, it would literally just keep playing through like this. So sometimes you have to think about how you can control your animation, and that's an area that we won't go into with these particular videos. But we just need it to play through once. So it plays through and gets this last frame here. That's when that special end of animation event happens, and that's when we're destroying our enemy sprite again. Okay, so with all of those little changes, and again they are little, but they have a big impact on the quality of our game, we get back to a situation, as we saw at the beginning of the video, where we now have what I would call technically a fully functioning and playable game. Again, it's not going to win any awards, but it's a great starting point and just something that you can at least see how things go. So nice title screen, makes it clear what it is. Press play. I've got my movement, I've got my shooting, I've got my sound effects, I've got my explosion, I've got my score. All the major elements of the game are there. And yeah, we're ready to go. Just as a sort of a heads up, if you like, of things that you might want to look at doing yourself, I certainly think the way the enemies are created needs to be better. I would look to maybe animate those characters a bit better as well, not just only when they explode, but how they fly, maybe different ones for the different scores. I certainly think we need to make it a bit harder. It's pretty easy just to keep playing it constantly like this. There's not really a progression. Maybe do some things like if you shoot a bullet off the screen, you lose some points. If you get to 0 points, you die. Things like that. So there's plenty more that we can do to this sort of game just to tidy it up and make it better. But here we go. That's the end of our tutorial. Hopefully you've got enough out of it to go off and add to this game, to build your own game, or at least enough of an interest now to say, hey, let's watch some other great tutorials and some really good ones out there, and see what else I can do with GameMaker. Hope you've had fun. Hope it's made some sense to you, and hopefully it's instilled, as I said, some interesting game development. Thanks for watching.